Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for this very special program dedicated to the memory of the events of 9/11. Before we continue with our featured speakers, I wanted to share with you an excerpt from my remarks 20 years ago at Congregation Habonim on Yom Kippur, just a few days after the events of 9/11. At that time, I shared some of the stories I'd read about concerning the individuals who perished on September 11th. I'd read about a fireman, Andrew Desperito, who was also summoned to rescue victims of a terrorist bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. At that time, he suffered from smoke inhalation, but otherwise emerged unscathed. On September 11, 2001, as a New York City firefighter escorted a woman to safety from the North Tower, he was buried under the crumbling rubble. And so are countless other firefighters and police officers who gave their lives trying to rescue the men and women trapped in the Twin Towers. I also read about a passenger on one of the flights, Lynn Angel, wife of Hollywood producer David Angel. The couple was traveling from Boston to attend the Emmy Awards that weekend. The couple was heavily involved in philanthropy, and Lynn spent much of her time volunteering as a librarian at Hillsides, a home for abused children that the couple helped. Lynn, in fact, sent each of its 66 residents a postcard from Cape Cod this past summer, I said at the time. The quote was, "She was a driving force behind creating one of the nicest children's libraries I've ever seen," home director John Hitchcock said. It's a huge loss to us. I read about Danny Lee, the roadie for the Backstreet Boys, who was determined to be at his wife's side when she gave birth to their second child. So after a long night breaking down the stage in Boston for the Backstreet Boys, he got the first flight back home to Los Angeles the next morning. I also read about Reverend Michael Judge, the New York City Fire Department chaplain, who died when he was hit by falling debris as he administered the last rites to a dying fireman at the scene of Tuesday's terrorist attacks. And then I read about the heroic efforts of 5 men on United Flight 99, who after they had learned of the other hijackings and intentional crashes, stormed the cockpit, causing their plane to crash in a Pennsylvania field. The actions of these men probably prevented the plane from hitting the White House and causing even more loss of life. One of the men on the plane who took part in this action was Jeremy Glick, who was taking his first business trip in months. Since the birth of his daughter Emmy 3 months prior, he had been reluctant to leave home until his wife felt that it was okay. About that story that I read about United Flight 99, there was a picture of Jeremy Glick. And obviously it was a recent picture because it shows him embracing a smiling newborn child. Some of the news magazines that covered the disaster showed pictures, just terrifying pictures, of people leaping from their flaming towers, to their deaths. One of the pictures showed a man and a woman holding hands as they fell to the earth, their last act before their deaths. And when I thought of that gesture, that last moment of handholding, and of the picture of Jeremy Glick kissing his newborn child, and of the countless stories of people calling their brothers and sisters, their mothers and fathers, their sons and daughters, their husbands and wives, and fiancés from the World Trade Center to tell them that they loved them and didn't know they'd ever survive. When I thought of that, I thought that I can think of no greater contrast to the legacy of the victims than to the legacy of the terrorists and what they left behind in the manner of their deaths. The last act of the victims of 9/11, the last hugs goodbye before they left for work, the last phone calls to their loved ones, showed us the kind of people who were lost in this tragedy, people who loved and were loved by others. By contrast, I doubt very much that the terrorists hugged anyone before their flights or made a desperate call to a dear one to wish them a tearful goodbye before they committed their evil acts. And when you love no one when you love no one and you're loved by no one, when you feel you have nothing left to live for, nothing to lose in life, then your life and the life of others may seem all too expendable. And so our response after September 11th, both in memory of the victims and as a denial for what the terrorists stood for, is to be more loving, to be kinder and gentler with each other, to pull ourselves closer to those who make our lives so much more meaningful by their very presence. Those are some of my words after 9/11, and they ring as true today for me as they did some 20 years ago. And now for tonight's program. I would like to introduce Andre Souroujon, who was a New York-based photographer when he captured some of the images from that fateful day. Andre was born in Mexico. His grandparents were Holocaust survivors who lived on a farm in Belgium during the war. His father escaped Belgium in 1940 as a stowaway on a boat to London. And after the traumatic events of 9/11, Andre moved to Toronto, where he lives with his wife and family, who are all currently members of Habonim.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending the presentation, and thank you, Ali, for the introduction. When I spoke to Ali for the first time, he asked me why I left New York in the early 2000s, and I told him about my story and how 9/11 changed my relationship to the city and eventually my move to Toronto. When the 20th anniversary of 9/11 was coming up, Ellie asked me more details about my experience there so that I could offer a firsthand account of what happened on that day and the following weeks. Hopefully this presentation will give you a new perspective and will give you some insights into that day 20 years ago. My day on 9/11 started like many others, hearing about it on the news. However, for me, the event took on an unexpected turn, and I will show you some of how that day played out. For 20 years, I never looked at some of the photos I will show you tonight. And while some were published internationally, they remained in my library until Ellie prompted me to look at them again. At the time, in 2001, I was a portrait and commercial photographer working for magazines such as Fortune, Time, Newsweek, and others. I regularly contributed to The Village Voice, which was a weekly that was a must-read for any young person in New York at the time and was widely available free throughout the city. I also worked with a photo agency, long since closed, called Gamma Press, and would sometimes get assignments from them. On 9/11, I had a scheduled shoot with a fund manager in Wall Street, and as was typical for this type of shoot, I had prepared my long list of equipment. Back then, it was a lot of equipment, including lighting for a portrait. And I was set to meet my assistant at 9:30 a.m. in downtown at the financial district. We were living at the time in the Upper West Side on 87th Street. And it was a particularly beautiful morning with uninterrupted blue skies and a perfect 20-degree Celsius temperature. As I was having coffee in the kitchen, I heard a distant explosion. Something I had heard once before as a young kid in Mexico City when a gas processing station exploded there. As it was distant and I could not see it, I shrugged it off and continued to get ready. A friend then reached out and asked us to turn on the TV. That is the moment that my wife and I, together with millions of others, started tuning to what just had transpired. Keep in mind that this was way before the smartphone and digital camera era, so we did not have the type of coverage and instant sharing that we have now. After being riveted by what we were seeing in the news and canceling my portrait shoot, I received a call from Gamma Press Agency asking me to cover the attack. While they had a regular slew of spot news photographers at the time, they could not reach any of them. I decided to take on the assignment. Knowing that the subway and taxis would probably not be a good way to navigate nearly 100 blocks, I took 10 rolls of assorted film and my mountain bike and started to head downtown. It turns out that was a great decision, as indeed all subways were shut down and traffic was severely restricted. This is where my presentation begins, and I'm just going to share my screen now. So I'm going to be today walking you through my travel down to Ground Zero and also tell you about the experience of watching the North Tower collapse from just a few blocks away. I'll open it up to questions at the end, and I can always bring back any images you would like to discuss at that point. What you see here is the original envelope of negatives that I kept in storage for 20 years. What is striking is that the description on the envelope was written by a staffer for Gamma Press just 2 or 3 hours after the attack. It's remarkable how accurate and precise the description was. Two hijacked planes crashed into the World Trade Center, destroying both towers. This is the timeline of that morning. At 8:46 a.m., the North Tower was hit first, and it was the second one to fall. 3 minutes later, the world started to learn about the crash, which initially was thought to be an accident. Then we watched in horror as a second plane crashed into the South Tower. Shortly after that, I received a call from Gamma Press. Would I be able to cover the event for them? I said yes and took on the assignment. I rode my mountain bike as fast as I could that morning, going down through the West End. Nevertheless, by the time I reached 34th Street, 9th Avenue, the South Tower, which was struck after the North Tower, had already collapsed in just 56 minutes. What you see here are people stunned to see that it had just collapsed. Further down, as I continued to bike through traffic and thousands of people watching, I could finally get a better look at the site, and I arrived on the West End Highway. It was inconceivable at the time to think that the entire tower had disappeared and that the landscape had literally changed forever. This was the scene as I arrived to the West End Highway and 22nd Street. I started to see thousands of workers leaving north, away from the plume of smoke that was blowing eastward. I knew that about 50,000 people worked in that complex, so unless they had all been evacuated, I feared that the death toll would be significant. Most of the people that were leaving were adults working in the financing industry, since at that era, there was very few residents in that area, unlike now. So it was really surprising to see these young people marching together with the adults up West End Avenue. I believe they were from the very prestigious public high school called Stuyvesant that was located in Battery Park, close to a walking bridge that later collapsed. I think these students' expression tell more of the true horror of that day. Stuyvesant High School is very close to Ground Zero, and these kids probably had a very close view of the World Trade Center Plaza. So these students may have witnessed the destruction and fall of the South Tower from very close. This image resonates with me as it captures the true horror of that day and is one of the few images showing younger people being affected by the attack. Rarely seen photos of how 9/11 directly affected younger children. As I was getting nearer, I decided to stop and stay at a safe distance from the tower. That's when we heard a loud and terrible bang, and I instinctively brought my camera to my eye and started to shoot continuously. At the time, you had just 36 frames, so you had to be judicious about shooting and not running out of film at a key moment. I shot a sequence of the tower falling and chose this particular photo for tonight because it shows very large pieces of the building falling from the top floors, which buckled the rest of the structure. It's interesting to note that this building, the North Tower, was struck by the plane on a higher floor than the South Tower, which may have been the reason it took longer to collapse from the weight above the crash area. As the tower fell, the noise was tremendous and the ground shook beneath our feet. The entire collapse took about 10 to 15 seconds. As it collapsed entirely, the plume of smoke began to grow. Here you can see a family with two young children, probably residents in Battery Park or Tribeca, running away from the plume. While most people before the tower collapsed were leaving quietly and slowly, now there was a true sense of urgency and panic to leave the site. I rode my bike closer to the edge of the plume and started seeing people come out of the plume. People were stunned, what they saw and stood perfectly quiet and still. Here you see a New York Police Department member being treated for dust exposure. You can tell which battalion a fireman is by the number on their helmets. In this case, the members of the 47th Battalion had just left the collapsed North Tower. We later learned that one member of that battalion had perished in the first collapse, in the South Tower collapse. And just keep in mind that this was just 30 minutes after that happened. Out of the plume came these two men covered in dust. I'm not sure if they were together or perhaps they shared the same office or were just friends, but they looked stunned and walked slowly, realizing they were now safe. Similarly, another businessman is ushered by the New York Police Department to be treated for exposure to dust. This is when I decided to hand over the film to Gamma Press as soon as possible, since it would need to be developed, since the film would need to be developed and scanned to have the images released worldwide as soon as possible. So I headed with my bike to Gamma offices Midtown, delivered the files and biked home. The rest of my day was like for so many others, watching the news as we gathered more information, but we could smell an acrid smell of pulverized concrete and gypsum for weeks after. It was a constant reminder of the devastation downtown. Gone was our North Star, where you would turn if you were lost in Greenwich Village or Soho. The sense of loss was overwhelming. I checked in with the Village Voice and discussed creating a follow-up photo essay that reflected the deep loss New Yorkers felt. And we came up with the idea of gathering tchotchkes related to the World Trade Center, which suddenly had taken a completely different meaning. I headed to Times Square and the most tourist stores the very next day. The entire city was at a standstill and there were barely anyone on the street. I bought some tchotchkes from those stores, including a spoon with the Twin Towers, various keychains, and a snow globe that eerily featured a plane on top of the World Trade Center. I also found a postcard of the Twin Towers and decided to find the exact spot where the photo had been taken in the late 70s and to try to hold up the postcard where the towers once were. I photographed it at about the same time as the attacks, and the day happened to be clear, exactly like on 9/11. The concept of this photo was to show the loss that New Yorkers had felt for the towers and the people murdered, and to show how each morning for months we had to remind ourselves that indeed the attack had actually happened, that the towers were no longer there. The Village Voice staff came up with a title, "Wish You Were Here." I think it resonated as it was a moment of instant nostalgia. We all wanted New York to be what it had been on September 10th. Here you see that image on the newspaper cover as it appeared on the September 18th edition. This cover won a Newsweekly award for the Village Voice. It's interesting to see that you can already see signs of life going back to normal by looking at the wanted ads on the back of the newspaper, which were generally placed right before publishing. What is interesting also is how our perception of 9/11 has changed since then. While the original photo was taken in 2001, it was also used in other publications over the years and now is in a permanent exhibit at the 9/11 Memorial at Ground Zero. On the 10th anniversary of 9/11 attack, Reader's Digest reached out to me to use the same photo. You can see here that there are some subtle differences, changes which I did not agree to. They photoshopped out some of the smoke that had been present in the original. There was the original smoke of the fire, as well as stylized the foreground showing the edge of the boardwalk. They had taken that out. The other headlines around the image also showed how the country had to a large extent processed the event and moved on. including the cost of colleges and top mistakes doctors make. I think a comparison of the two covers shows how over time an event takes on a different and diminished role, and how it is sanitized and made more palatable over time. I'm happy to share this story with you, and along with thousands of others that day, I think it's up to us to keep the real memory of that event alive so that we can have an accurate representation of history. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story. Big thank you to Ellie as well for prodding me to share the story with you, and thank you to Habonim for sharing it with the community. I'm really grateful that I finally got to see the images and to share my story. I hope that you all go to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in Ground Zero. It's not an easy exhibit to experience, but it's really remarkable, and it will give you an even better sense of the enormity of that moment. I'm now open for any questions.
So Andre, if I may begin,
Yes.
I did not realize that image that you have that was on the cover of the Village Voice, that was smoke. I just thought it might have been some clouds in the sky. So is that still smoke from 9/11? Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. That was shot 2 days after 9/11. So that smoke was there for weeks on end. So that was actually very recent. And I happened to I did it on purpose, but I wanted to be there at the same time that the attacks happened. So this was roughly around 8:30 a.m. This is taken right beside the Brooklyn Bridge on the Brooklyn side. There's a little park right beside near Dumbo. I just found the actual location where the original photo had been taken.
Did you ever speak to Reader's Digest and complain to them, or you just said let it water under the bridge, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean it was not something, it was already published, so there was nothing to do. But it wasn't. I don't think that it was that offensive, but to me it just kind of signaled, they stylized the photo, and I guess to a certain extent, Reader's Digest would probably do that normally, but when it's this type of image, you would think that they would leave it the way it was, but they didn't.
Yeah, it should be considered sacred. Interesting. Well, because of what you shared with me, I now realize that wasn't clouds, that was smoke. So I guess there was a silver lining to them doing that, because otherwise I would have thought it was just some clouds in the sky. So thank you for explaining that. Yes. On a broader sort of subject, would you feel comfortable sharing with us how 9/11 changed you as a person, your beliefs in humanity, and I guess it influenced you to move from the United States to Canada? Please share with us a bit of your own personal journey from that terrible day.
Yeah, I mean, for the nostalgia that we all felt for New York pre 9/11 was just tremendous, because we had a wonderful apartment for West Side. My wife was expecting at the time, and it really changed, at least for the first 6 months. The city was there was postings at the hospital where we were doing Lamaze classes. There was postings for missing people, and it was just a very heavy environment to be in New York. Very sad. It was difficult because my daughter was born around just 3 months later, and it took a little bit of the actually a lot of the spark from New York for us, and we started to think of other places. I wouldn't say it was the main reason, but it certainly contributed to it.
And how about your own personal philosophy? I guess your belief in democracy, your belief in humanity. How was that affected by that experience?
Yeah, I think I was struck by what Clinton, who was not president anymore, said about the World Trade Center, that they attacked people from all over the world in the World Trade Center. So there was really an attack on the world. It wasn't an attack just on Americans. And I think that struck for me, more than, George Bush saying, they're going to hear from us. To me, that was, a little bit at the time already seemed a little bit vengeful. And that was not my, what I was thinking at the time. One thing I didn't mention is when I was, after the second tower had fallen, about 5 minutes later, maybe 10 minutes later, suddenly you heard the roar of F-15s, going around New York City, and that moment really felt like war. Like war. It was quite striking.
How do you compare you living in the United States, living in Canada these days? Do you feel it was a good move for you to join us in the land of the frozen chosen, as we call ourselves?
Yeah, I love New York. I love New York. My daughter's living there, and I think it's very much back to what it used to be. So I love Canada as well. I don't, I think that it's Canada in general has been incredibly good for us, and I think, I brought my wife here, and I think she's quite happy as well. But New York is still a fantastic place, and I would certainly we visit a lot, and I would move there in a second. Yeah.
Well, we have many family members in New York, and watching today some of the memorials, looking at the resilience and the courage and the faith and the devotion that the people have 20 years later for lost loved ones. It's quite inspiring, and I agree. New York was a great city and still is a great city. So I'm happy you shared those sentiments with us. So we have at least one person on the line with us this evening, Alan Lefton from New York City, who also experienced 9/11 from his own perspective. And Alan, if you can hear us, are you on the line? So Theodore, maybe you could unmute Alan. And Alan, you can introduce yourself and share with us a bit of who you are and how you came to view the events of 9/11.
I can't compete with Andre because he did an awesome job right now. So I'm not quite sure where I should start.
Well, to describe to us where you were working, what you were doing, I guess, the morning of.
Sure. I work in finance, and I was literally at the tip of Manhattan. And I did have a view of the Twin Towers, but I never thought to look at it at that time. And early in the morning, I was at work, and there was a person that I worked with. And basically he said, there was a plane that hit the Twin Towers. I didn't think anything of it. I thought it was basically a small plane. The pilot might have gotten sick or passed out, and, it was a bad accident. And 10 minutes later, he said, hey, it was an airline. And I'm like, so now I'm thinking this may be a little bigger deal. And I work in finance, so we're always busy. So I'm working, and all of a sudden, I hear this very loud bang, explosion, so to speak, and I knew this was not good. Then I did go to the window, and I see both towers burning, and I knew we were under attack. And my first reaction is, why? Who? What do I do? What do they do? It was shock. I never expected to go into work and have this happen to me at this point. And believe it or not, I had to go back to work. And I did, and then I just couldn't. So I went back, and I joined everybody else looking out the window, seeing what was going on. And dealing with everybody else's shock. It's, again, nobody knew what to do. Nobody knew where to go. Nobody knew why this was happening, who was doing it, what have you. And then the first tower fell, and everybody was crying. again, what do we do? Do we stay in the building? Do we leave? What do we do? So what ended up happening was the president of the company said, go to the lobby. So we all went down to the lobby, and this is after the first tower had fallen. And we're just sitting in this lobby. We can't go anyplace. We didn't know where to go. And then the second tower fell. We didn't see it from the lobby, but we certainly heard it. And we knew what was happening, and we're sitting there and we're looking at each other. Then and in the lobby, it was facing the street, and it was all glass doors and windows. And then all of a sudden you could see this dark smoke get darker and darker and darker. And it was like, if you can imagine, it was almost like something from the Ten Commandments, the angel of death, so to speak. It got pitch black, literally. It was like midnight, and this was in a bright day on 9/11. And then finally, the smoke cleared, and everybody looked at each other saying, what do we do? Where do we go? I don't know are the subways running, what have you. So since I was at the tip of Manhattan, literally across the street was the Staten Island ferry. So I gathered some people that I knew lived near me, and I said, I'm getting on this ferry if it's running. We got to the ferry, about 7 of us. We got on, and the ferry left about 5 minutes later, and the ferry pulls away. And now we're seeing all of Manhattan, and I'm seeing the smoke going all across from the Twin Tower area, all across lower Manhattan. And am I watching a movie? Is this really happening? It was a shock. That's an understatement. We finally got to Staten Island. And again, we're looking at Manhattan Island, and everybody's, okay, what do we do now? So without going into a long story about this, it took me about 7 or 8 hours to get home, getting on buses that we didn't know where we were even going. Nobody was charging any money to go anyplace. Finally, we got to a train station in New Jersey, which is where I lived. And finally, about 7 or 8 hours later, we got to a train station in New Jersey. I got home. Someone drove us to our houses. And that was the beginning of the world that we live in today. I consider 9/11 almost like a dividing line between then and now. The whole world changed. It wasn't a New York thing. It was a world thing.
So thank you, Alan. Before we go to our last speaker, how did it change your philosophy of the world? Did it change momentarily for a little while and you went back to what your usual self? How did it change your view of the world? Did you feel less safe? Explain to us your psychological reaction, both short-term and long-term.
Oh, it changed everything. I still never feel safe riding on a plane, going any place at all. I never feel safe. And I'm not alone in this feeling with most of the people that I know. Just going to the airport every time I go to an airport, it reminds me of that day. So I don't feel safe. I try to keep it out of my head. I need to live from day to day, and I'm not going to try to let this stop my life. But yes, it's an everyday reminder, no matter where I go, no matter what I do. And I'm not sure if everybody knows or if you know, Rabbi, but I work in the new World Trade Center now. The rebuilt building, the company that I work in moved to that building. And I have worked in that building, and I do not feel safe at all.
Even though apparently they built it to all the most up-to-date safety precautions taken into account, correct? Even so, let me just kind of be
devil's advocate. I agree with you. It's supposed to be one of the safest buildings in the world. However, if a 757 flies into that building at 400 miles an hour, the airplane isn't going to bounce off. The people inside are going to get hurt. Yes, there's a better chance that people may escape, but it's still a target. And working in that building after everything that I've told you, what I saw, does not make me feel comfortable at all.
I understand. Well, thank you for sharing that. I know it was difficult for you. We're now going to ask our last speaker. Her name is Eleni Anagnostikos, and I think her name might be under iPhone. So Theodore, if you want to open up iPhone, there you are, Eleni.
Hi.
Thank you. Would you like to tell us what you were doing? I think it looks like you're outside on a boat.
I'm on a boat.
Okay, well, we can hear you loud and clear. Can you tell
Okay.
us where you were on the morning of 9/11 and just take us through the events of that morning?
Okay. I was actually late to work on Monday, the day before. It was like, I got to work at like 8:40 and we were new stockbrokers. So they wanted us there early. So on 9/11, I got to work at 7:30 and I look up at the towers and I'm like, wow, I love that I work here. It's such a beautiful day. And I was like, I love this place. I went to Tower 1, got a muffin, and then went to my building, Tower 2. I worked at Weatherly Securities, and it was the 29th floor. So when I got there, it was all the young stockbrokers, like all the guys. I was the only girl. It was a very small firm. We were like laughing. They were laughing at me because I got sent home the day before. It was the first time I was ever late. Anyway, so I go to my office. It was like 8:45, and I'm cold calling to get a client, and I hear a bam. And everybody's like, oh my God, what was that? So obviously that was Tower 1. So no, it was good the way it was. Thanks. All right. So, and so we all ran down the stairs, but we couldn't run because it was so many people. So we're going slowly down 29 floors. All I could smell was burning rubber. We had no idea what was going on. But one guy, he was like ghost white. And we're like, oh my God. He goes, yeah, I was in the bombing in 93, I guess. I don't know when it was, but he was also in the tower when there was a bombing. So when we got to the main floor, there was like smoke and fire and everything in the main lobby. So me and 3 other people from my firm went through the basement. There was nobody there. Through the basement, like where the mall was. So we're like running through, have no idea what's going on. So, you know, so much adrenaline. And I had been calling my mom on my little Sprint phone over and over again. And it was busy, busy, busy. Like I was freaking out. I had no idea what was going on, you know? I got up to the other side and we're running. There's like stuff everywhere. Like, I don't know at the time what it was, but obviously it was debris, people jumping, people falling, people everywhere. People were stuck standing and I'd be like, go, what are you doing? Just go. I don't know what's going on, but just go. People were standing there and I would stop and like help them to go. And so now my phone's ringing and I turn around and I look up and there's the second plane hitting my tower and it's my mom and she says, hello. And I say, oh my God. And the phone shut off as the plane hit. So my mom's upstate New York. She thinks I'm dead, freaking out because of the timing. It was like a movie, like, oh my, right? So everyone upstate's freaking out. My sister's in school. They are watching the news. She's freaking out. Everybody's freaking out. I'm with one of the girls from my firm and she's freaking out. And she's like, where do I go? What do I do? What do I do? And I go, where do you live? And she goes, Staten Island. I'm like, I gave her $20. I could just go. I don't know. There's got to be a train or something. She went the other way and I ran to the train and everyone just standing, taping, videotaping, and all like, I just screaming, go. So I got to the train and it was like like a movie. It was like everybody's in black and white, but I was in color. Everybody just sitting there and no one knew what was going on the train except I'm sweating and I sat on the ground. I was like, oh my God. And I'm freaking out thinking, hopefully my mom is okay and everybody's okay because they probably don't think I'm okay. So we went upper level of the train and it says, this is your last stop. We're not running anymore. And I'm crying and nobody knew I was crying, but they looked across because it was above level and they could see the towers across from Queens to New York to Manhattan. And they're like, oh my God, are you okay? I'm like, I don't know. So I get downstairs and I'm walking to a cab and I said, what's going on? And I got in the cab and they're playing like the news, like, we don't know what it is. If it's a bomb, something hit the building, the plane hit the building, we don't know. And finally, I talked to my mom hours later and she's freaking out. She didn't believe I was alive, even till I saw her. She must have lost like 10 years off of her life from stress, like freaking out. Polly, are those the lights behind us? I think those are the lights.
Yes.
I don't know if you could see the tower lights behind us. Can you see the lights? Can you see them dimly back there? I can't hear you guys. You guys?
I believe so. I believe so. There's a lot of lights back there. I'm not sure which is which. Maybe you want to pan again for a moment?
Yeah, all right, right there. Going all the way up. It's the tower of lights. It's very dim, but we could see it from the water, which is cool. Yeah, I guess I would have like a little post-traumatic stress from that. I didn't really work as a stockbroker after that. I let my license expire like a
Can I ask you a question? Did you ever think, like we heard how Andre still loves New York? Obviously, Alan stayed in New York, even though he does feel traumatized to some extent. But did you ever think of leaving New York, or you're a New Yorker?
No,
and that's where you're
I
gonna
love
stay?
New York. Love New York. I love Greece. I like Miami. I love the beach. I love the beach, but I love New York. I like the action. I like the people. I like the what is it? Diversity. Yeah, of course. It's amazing. So many different people, so many different kinds of people, not like all on the same level. Do you know what I mean? All walks of life. I love New York.
Well, it's wonderful to hear people who experienced 9/11 still have the resilience and the faith and the love and the devotion to this wonderful city. So I'd like to conclude by thanking Andre and Eleni and Alan for sharing with us so eloquently their images and words from that day. And I want to close with a poem which I will read and a song that was performed by Viva Reisky and Tom Bellman. The poem I'm going to read is adapted from a piece by Rabbi Jack Reimer from a memorial prayer placed by United Airlines in the New York Times right after 9/11. And it's called A Prayer for the 11th of September by Rabbi Jack Reimer. On Monday, September 10th, when people asked me how I was feeling, I replied without thinking, fine, thank you. On Monday, September 10th, the papers and the magazines were filled with important stories about the fall TV schedule. On Monday, September 10th, there were not many people in the religion section of the bookstores. On Monday, September 10th, I passed strangers without saying hello. And then on Tuesday, September 11th, the world changed, and I did too. On Tuesday, September 11th, someone tried to take America apart, and instead, on Tuesday, September 11th, America came together as never before. On Tuesday, September 11th, there were no longer white-collar workers and blue-collar workers. On Tuesday, September 11th, there were only people trying to help other people. On Tuesday, September 11th, strangers died for each other. On Tuesday, September 11th, the best of the human spirit spit back into the very eye of the worst of humanity. On Tuesday, September 11th, America was knocked to its knees. And on Tuesday, September 11th, it was knocked to its knees. On Tuesday, September 11th, America got back up again. May we not soon forget the lessons that we learned on that day. May we not ever think again that a stranger going by is just a stranger. May we not ever think again that we are too busy to hug our children or too tired to tell our mates that we love them. May we not answer, fine, thank you, without thinking when someone asks us how we are, the way we did on Monday, September 10th. Instead, let us really be grateful that we are alive, grateful that we have children to hug and mates to love, and grateful that we live in a free country. And let us be grateful for the human spirit that can rise above every catastrophe and triumph over every adversity, the way it did on Tuesday, September 11th. It's a poem by Rabbi Jack Reimer. We will now close with a moving musical version of Each of Us Has a Name, L'chol Ish Hashem, in memory of all the victims of 9/11, performed by Aviva Reisky and Tom Bellman. L'chol Ish Hashem, Each of Us Has a Name, in memory of the victims of 9/11.
Before I sing the following Hebrew song, L'chol Ish Yeshem, written by the famous Israeli poet Zelda, I'd like to read it to you in English, the translation written by Marcia Falk. Each of us has a name. Each of us has a name given by God and given by our parents. Each of us has a name given by our stature and our smile and given by what we wear. Each of us has a name given by the mountains and given by our walls. Each of us has a name given by the stars and given by our neighbors. Each of us has a name given by our sins and given by our longing. Each of us has a name given by our enemies and given by our love. Each of us has a name given by our celebrations and given by our work. Each of us has a name given by the seasons and given by our blindness. Each of us has a name given by the sea and given by our death. לכל איש יש שם שנתן לו אלוהים ונתנו לו אבי ואמו. לכל איש יש שם שנתנו לו קומתו ואופן חיוכו ונתן לו האריג. לכל איש יש שם שנתנו לו ההרים ונתנו לו כתלה. לכל איש יש שם שנתנו לו המזלות ונתנו לו שכינה. לכל איש יש שם, לכל איש יש שם. לכל איש יש שם שנתנו לו חטאה ונתנה לו כמיהתו. לכל איש יש שם שנתנו לו שונאה ונתנה לו אהבתו. לכל איש יש שם שנתנו לו חגה ונתנה לו מלאכתו. לכל איש יש שם שנתנו לו תקופות השנה ונתן לו עיוורונו. לכל איש יש שם, לכל איש יש שם. לכל איש יש שם שנתן לו אלוהים ונתנו לו אבי ואמו. לכל איש יש שם שנתן לו הים, ונתן לו מותו.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. Gemar Chatima Tova, wishing everyone an easy fast. Lech LaShalom. Go in peace. Have a good evening.